Hi, I'm Lance from RigWheels. Slow shutter time-lapse and drive-lapse shots are a great way for you to add dynamic images to your videos. And I want to share a quick tutorial with you of how I execute some of these shots when I'm out on location. Slow shutter time-lapse produces unique and very different results from ordinary time-lapse because it allows the movement in the image to blur to varying degrees depending on what's desired for the shot. Ordinary time-lapse can have a very staccato or jumpy feel to it. So to produce a higher quality shot with more artistic value, we're going to increase the exposure time. You can use these methods with most any camera with an internal or external intervalometer, but my new camera of choice for this kind of time-lapse is the Lumix GH4. I picked up the GH4 a while back to use on my multi-rotor for aerial video, but while playing around with it, I found a feature that my clients are really in love with. The GH4 will assemble all of the still frames from a time-lapse and generate a video file inside the camera. Some other cameras are doing this now, but remember it's slow shutter that we're after. If you shoot and edit your own projects, this feature may not be that important, but for my clients, I'm usually delivering the material at the end of the day or at the end of the project, and then an editor in some distant land has to sift through all my material. If I'm delivering thousands of frames of unrendered time-lapse, that creates a lot of work for an editor. And if they're on a tight budget or a tight schedule, those frames may never see the finished piece. Being able to deliver finished slow shutter time-lapse files along with the rest of the daily material has been a great asset in my toolbox recently. Another benefit of the automatic movie is the instant feedback that it gives you about the shot. Seeing the assembled time-lapse so you can make adjustments as needed in the field is a lifesaver. First, you're going to need some ND to control the amount of light that comes into the camera. Using just the aperture, you won't be able to stop down far enough to get the exposure time long enough. Typically with the GH4 during the daytime, I have to stack two 1.2 density ND filters to get the exposure time that I need. You'll have to experiment with your camera and lens setup to figure out just how much is required for you. I have two initial settings for a couple different types of shots that I'm usually after. One for where the camera will be mounted to a moving object like a car or train, and another for where the camera will be stationary with things moving around it. In the first scenario where the camera is attached to a moving object, I set the camera for half-second exposures and I set the intervalometer to take 1 shot per second. When the camera is stationary, I set the shot for 1 second exposures and again the intervalometer for 1 shot per second. This is a jump-off point and you'll typically adjust the settings from there to get the right amount of motion blur and sense of speed in the shot after you see a sample. Exposure time controls the amount of motion blur, and the number of shots per second controls the sense of speed in the time-lapse. For example, if you start out at half-second exposures, taken 1 per second, and you want to speed up the time-lapse, you could decrease the frequency to 1 shot every 2 or 3 seconds. However, for the smoothest effect, more frequency is better. You can always speed up the entire time-lapse in post, but the amount of motion blur and the smoothness of the time-lapse have to be captured in camera. In order to preserve details on the highlights, I generally underexpose by about a stop. If you're going to be driving, try to plan ahead for the brightness of the areas that you'll be driving through so they're not overexposed or too underexposed. The camera should be set to full manual. Automatic changes to focus, exposure, or white balance will ruin the shot. And if you have a lens with image stabilization, you should also turn that off. Foreground is your friend. With all of the motion created by time-lapse, it can really help the shot to have some foreground element in the frame, like the side or the hood of a car. Stop-and-go traffic can also be really nice because you get the sense of going in and out of the warp effect. Of course, I do all this with the help of one of my favorite RigWheels products, the RigMount X. This is an incredibly strong magnetic camera mount that makes secure mounting faster and easier than you've ever experienced. One of the main complaints I used to get from producers about driving and time-lapse shots was the amount of time it would take to rig and execute the shot. RigMount X makes this process so simple now that I can set my shot and be rolling in seconds. Most of the time I'm just stealing these shots while in transit or filming other things on location. Production doesn't have to allocate me time to get them anymore. I just keep this rig built and nearby and then keep my eyes open for some interesting opportunities. 5 minutes with this slow shutter technique and the RigMount X stuck to a car or a lamppost can get you a shot with impressive visual impact. Our rig mounts have a protective rubber coating so they won't damage the surface that you're mounting to. And for those of us who remember the perils of recording on videotape, magnets don't affect flash memory. RigMount X with just 4 of our magnets has up to 200 pounds of pulling force. Once you feel it grab onto a piece of metal, I'm sure you'll be as excited about it as we are. The combination of the functionality of the GH4 along with the quick setup of RigMount X have made this technique a staple in my projects. I wish you the best results in executing these types of shots for yours. You can see more detail about slow shutter technique as well as RigMount X on rigwheels.com. Thanks for watching.